weight was crushing in on Darkstalker's chest, making it difficult to breathe. All the memories were consuming him, eating him alive from the inside out, and he didn't know how much more he could take. He'd accepted this deal with Moon because he thought it would be a sure way to earn her trust, to help her understand him, but now he regretted it deeply. Telling the story of Clearsight had opened up 1,000 wounds from which he bled sorrow and heartache that was swallowing him up. Blinking, he found himself in front of the door he had earlier forbidden Moon from entering. It was the one thing he wasn't ready for anyone else to face. It was the last remnant of his old world. Opening the door, he stepped inside the room that felt far too small. It had felt small back when he had been first assigned to it upon moving into the castle at the Queen's behest. Now, with his greater stature, it felt almost claustrophobic. But here were the memories he'd hoped had been saved. A desk cluttered with ink pots that had long since gone dry, and scrolls filled with notes and calculations on spells and war plans. Shelves on the wall were filled with seemingly random objects. The little mechanical contraptions he'd tinkered with when bored. The little scavenger doll Whiteout had given him so that he wouldn't be lonely in the castle. And the music box he'd bought when he was only 18 months old, with a coin Mother had given him as a reward for doing chores around the house. He hadn't known what possessed him to buy it. It had been a broken, run-down antique being sold off for parts. But he'd taken it home and repaired it, and then used his magic so that it would never fall apart again. It always made such beautiful music. That night at the ball, the musicians had played the same tune as the box. It was the melody that had always turned over and over inside his head. And there, on the far wall, was the painting of Clearsight. He'd done it in school as part of a project. It wasn't that good, and some of the proportions were off, but he loved it. 2,000 years hadn't been kind to the portrait, even though this closet of a room had no windows for sunlight to eat at it. It was faded and cracked, but he could still make out her image within the canvas. She looked exactly like Moon. There were a few differences, of course. Clearsight had amethyst eyes, whereas Moon's were the green of sparkling emeralds. Moon had the silver teardrop scales by her eyes where Clearsight hadn't. But the resemblance between the two was staggering. It had almost shocked him when he'd first seen Moon in the flesh, almost called her by another name. He thought he'd gotten used to it, but after tonight he couldn't shake it out of his head.
"How could you do this, Clearsight?"
Darkstalker whispered, reaching out a talon to gently stroke the face of the dragoness in the painting.
"How could you leave me? Expect me to move on, and yet haunt me with your likeness and the one friend I have in this world?"
And then his brows drew down in anger.
"Or did you not ever want me to wake up?"
In the corner of the room lay his old bed. He had barely fit it back in the day, let alone now. Slowly taking hold of the sheet, he stood on his back legs and draped it over the portrait. It hurt too much to see it. These thoughts hurt too much to think them. But he couldn't put them off. He was stuck in a labyrinth of agony that had no end.
"You can't leave me in this world alone, Clearsight,"
he told her, his touch lingering on the covered painting.
"I need you back. I will have you back."
Some part of his mind was sounding an alarm, but it was almost as if all of his emotions had been poisoned with a paralysis toxin. He was so emotionally spent, he couldn't feel anything anymore, and all the voices of rational thought were closed behind a glass door, so that he was running purely on impulse. It was like watching himself move through a dream, and he watched himself crawl through the many passages of the castle until he sank below it and went deep into the dungeons. His body knew exactly where to go. He'd been down this route often enough in the last few days. In a cell in the furthest, darkest dungeon, where no one would ever hear cries or screams, where not even telepaths could reach this far below, sat his prisoner. Rusty but strong manacles and chains secured her to the far wall. A small, bloody plate beside her had shown she'd eaten. Her cracked, dusty, colored scales had started to accumulate filth from the dungeon floor, and her eyes were rimmed with shadows. The Sandwing thief, who'd only referred to herself as Picker, had never escaped that night. It was an unfortunate lie that he'd had to tell Moon, but there was no other way. He caught her in the mountains and brought her here. the perfect subject for him to glean information from. On a table by the cell door, just out of her reach, lay the amulet of concealment. It glinted gold and red in the dim light of a torch Darkstalker had left out. It oozed an aura of anticipation, knowing its master was near. The amulet had been originally created to placate Vigilance's want for more flashy spells in the war. She wanted spells that would kill an entire Icewing platoon. Clearsight and Favin had argued against it. This had been the compromise. An amulet that would allow spies and assassins to assume the guise of any tribe they wish. But Darkstalker was no fool, and knew that sooner or later, if he were not careful, then his own enchantments would be used against him. When he officially begun to craft Animus-touched objects for the Queen, all his enchanted items had a secret secondary spell placed upon them that would only work for him. A failsafe, a master key only he could wield. The one placed on the amulet, so that when he ordered it, the dragon wearing the amulet would transform, physically, mentally, and emotionally, into a complete other dragon. Usually, the amulet would only allow the wearer to transform into what they would look like had they been born to another tribe. But over the past 2 dawns, Darkstalker had used the amulet on Picker, transforming her into the different queens of Pyria. When he ordered it to transform her into Queen Coral, for example, she completely became her, with all her memories and personality quirks the same as the real version. It had been a great way for him to keep up with all the latest news around the continent. He picked up the amulet, feeling its weight in his large bony talon. At the scrape of the gold chain against the wood, Picker cracked open her eyes. She stared up at his shadow through the bars of her cell.
"The master comes,"
she whispered hoarsely. She'd taken to calling him that. He certainly never asked her to. Perhaps she did it in an effort to appease him so he would let her go. All her slave-like devotion did was creep him out.
"I'm sorry for these appalling conditions, Picker,"
he said in a flat voice void of emotion.
"but with any luck, this will be the last dawn you spend in this cell."
He opened the cell door and made his way slowly towards her, his feet dragging. Claws clutched the amulet to his chest, its weight seeming to grow heavier as it named its prey. Picker tried to stand, one leg splintered and bandaged. Her crazed eyes looked eager.
"Anything the master wishes, I will do."
Did she really want to please him, or was she so addicted to the feel of gold touching her scales, she would do almost anything to have the amulet placed upon her? It didn't matter either way. Joints stiff, Darkstalker held up the amulet and slipped it over Picker's head and slid it into place around her neck. He poked the large ruby at its center with one wickedly long claw.
"Become Clearsight."
Picker suddenly coughed, her breathing ragged, her sandy scales darkened, black veins snaking across her form to try and transform her to the color of shadows. Her eyes flickered from yellow to violet. It seemed that the transformation was taking hold of her. But then the Sandwing doubled over, coughing violently, legs trembling and her appendages going thin, veins popping out all across her body. Blood poured from the corners of her mouth and instantly turned to dust. She was dying. Darkstalker surged forward and touched the amulet once again.
"Stop!"
And then he wrenched the amulet off her. Instantly, Picker returned to normal and flopped on the floor, exhausted. He pushed a nearby bowl of water towards her, making her drink. When she had at least taken a few sips, he let her be. There was always the possibility that this wouldn't work. Rumor had it that Animus magic could do almost anything aside from 2 things: time travel and bring back the dead. Had even the amulet's enchantment pushed the boundaries of these rules? He'd ordered it to become Clearsight, and since she was dead, it had tried to mimic that state. Or perhaps there was another reason, some dark corner of his mind whispered to him. It brought up the conversation he had had with Moon last night, that NightWings used to believe in reincarnation, that a soul destined for greatness would come back to fulfill the life destiny had meant for them. Was that why Moon looked like Clearsight? Was she? He was moving before he knew what he was doing. Once again that numbness had taken hold of him. A part of his mind was screaming at him, demanding he stop, but it felt like that other part was in control now. This desire to end his torment would not be stopped, and so shut down all rational thought he possessed. The sun was up as he found his way towards Moon's rooms. Silent as a shadow, he crept into her chambers and found her asleep within the newly refurbished bed they worked on hours earlier. She lay curled up and peaceful, head laid daintily on her crossed talons. He stood over her bed, and all at once seemed to come back to himself as he held the amulet of concealment in one talon. His eyes flickered between it and Moon. How at rest she looked, completely trusting, feeling entirely safe within these walls. And here he was, contemplating whether or not he should turn her into Clearsight, paralyzed with indecision. He loved Clearsight. He'd loved her since he was a Dragonet. His whole future had been centered around her, and since she'd left him, he'd felt so lost and alone. The ache inside him felt like it was cracking him open, wider and wider without her. Yet at the same time, he still felt so angry at what she had done. It wasn't because she had thwarted his plans. It was the fact that she had sent him into a future where he was completely isolated and with no one to guide him. And everything he'd ever known and loved ripped away until he almost didn't know who he was himself anymore. And for that, he couldn't forgive her. The desperate want inside of him to have her back was almost suffocating him. The idea of having that love back with him and to not be alone anymore was too tempting. Yet to do that, he would have to put this amulet onto Moon, and what if it didn't work? What if what happened to Picker would also happen to Moon? He would never forgive himself if he hurt her. But then, what if it did work? To replace Moon with Clearsight forever would effectively mean killing Moon. The very idea made him feel sick. He cared about Moon so much. In his life, he had cared genuinely for very few dragons, and Moon had driven herself into his heart so irretrievably, he was willing to do anything to please her, to see her thrive and grow. He loved the way she made him laugh, was eternally grateful to her for being the first friend he'd had in 2,000 years, the one who had made his isolation bearable. She was the one where, despite everything she learned of him thus far, was still willing to see good in him, to believe in him. The amulet fell from his claws and clacked against the floor. The air rushed out of his lungs in one powerful, quiet half-sob. Tears fell from his eyes as his brain finally caught up with itself. Of course he couldn't do it. How could he have ever possibly considered it in the first place? Quietly, he knelt by Moon's bedside and hung over her. Gently as he could, he pressed his forehead to hers and closed his eyes, letting his tears wash away the sin he'd almost committed.
Forgive me,
he whispered. And then, with no noise, he swept up the amulet and fled her chambers, unknowing of the tears he had left on her bedside, or how her eyes flooded open to find only the emptiness and droplets soaking her sheets. Darkstalker moved through the castle as fast as he could. Guilt poisoned his soul. He couldn't stand the sight of anything that reminded him of this dreadful night. Thankfully, the painting was already covered. He ran to his chambers and stuffed the amulet into a desk drawer that still had a working lock. He planned to leave that accursed thing there forever if he must. Next, he hurried down to the dungeons and, unconcerned if the prisoner saw his tear-streaked face, threw open her cell door and snapped off her chains.
Go,
he told her.
Leave now. By sunset, I don't want you anywhere near this kingdom.
He expected her to leave in a hurry, to stand and limp away as fast as she could. But instead, Picker crowded at his talons like an accolade before her high priest. Her eyes were wide and filled with awe.
Master cannot send me out into the unforgiving lands now. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to best serve you, Master, and I will. Promise.
Perhaps her time living alone and then in these dungeons had made her a little soft in the head. He backed up out of her cell, but she eagerly followed. In his hasty attempt to be rid of her, Darkstalker said,
Fine! Just leave! Leave the Night Kingdom and... spy for me. Go out to the world and learn what you can. Anything important, I don't care. Just go!
Yes, Master!
She cried happily.
Thank you, Master!
And then she hopped away, singing a merry off-key tune that echoed amidst the vast walls of the dungeons.